What's up, witches? I'm Allie the Bronx Witch, and welcome to my channel where you are the magic, and where I talk about Wicca the religion, witchcraft the practice, and I do weekly tarot readings. And in my weekly tarot readings, you guys have been mentioning in the comments that you would like me to make some videos or talk a little bit more about tarot in general, and recommendations about getting started or information on how to start or how to approach a journey into tarot reading. So I thought it might be fun to make some videos for you guys to help you out on your journey. I'll mention that these tips are specifically for tarot reading, but you could probably apply them to pretty much any other form of divination. I'll start out by saying that this list is not intended to be fully exclusive or inclusive in any way. These are just 5 things that I thought were useful pieces of information that I have kind of gathered over the years. And if you're interested in pursuing tarot or other forms of divination, you might find these tips helpful as well. And of course, tarot is something that can literally be taught for a lifetime, and it's something that you learn over the course of a lifetime. So there's so much more to talk about than just what's in these 5 tips, but this should get you started. And because this is a list of tips rather than like a how-to, definitely take into consideration that these are my recommendations for how to begin a relationship with tarot or other forms of divination. So my first tip, I think, is very important. I think it's critical that every person who approaches tarot asks themselves this question first. And that is, why am I learning tarot? And I know that stuff like that can be annoying because when you want tips, you want like hard and fast, like do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. But I think it's really important that you first start off with this moment of consideration. The reason why this question is important is because I believe there is a very different approach, and should be a very different approach to reading tarot based on whether or not you want to read for yourself and you want to use tarot reading as a part of a personal spiritual journey, or if you intend to read for others, and especially if you intend to charge people or try to pursue tarot reading as a profession. I think it's important that you understand which one of those things is your ultimate goal, because how you go about your journey is different based on that goal. Now, you don't need to commit to this goal for the rest of your life. It's totally fine if you change your mind down the road. This is not something that you're locking in at all. But it is an important place to start, because I think that you can approach your tarot journey in very different ways based on the answer to this question. Tip number 2 is about choosing the right deck. And this is why asking the question about what it is you want to do with your initial jump into tarot is important. Because what type of deck you choose and how you get started in that regard is definitely different based on those 2 answers. So I'm going to start first by talking about if you decided that you want to learn about tarot from sort of an empirical standpoint. You really want to learn about the tarot itself, its esoteric meanings, its symbolism, its history, and you would like to apply that knowledge to read for others, perhaps even professionally. And the reason why I start there is because I believe if that is your goal, then your approach to choosing a deck is a little bit more limited. I highly, highly, highly recommend that if you want to learn about tarot in an in-depth way, and especially if you want to charge people for readings ultimately, I highly recommend that you begin your tarot journey with the Rider-Waite-Smith traditional deck. Even though it is true that there are other styles of decks other than the Rider-Waite-Smith system, 90% of all decks pretty much comply with this system breakdown. And if you don't know what I mean when I say the Rider-Waite-Smith traditional deck, I am talking about the deck illustrated by Pamela Coleman Smith. And the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is comprised of 78 cards, 22 of which belong in what's called the Major Arcana section of the deck, and 56 of which are in the Minor Arcana section of the deck. And the Minor Arcana section of the deck is divided into 4 suits: swords, wands, coins, and cups. Most decks, even though they differ from the traditional art created by Pamela Coleman Smith, most decks still follow that system, that particular breakdown, even though they change the imagery on the cards. Most decks also generally adhere to the same understood meanings and definitions, if you will, of these cards and the images on them. But even though most cards follow the Rider-Waite-Smith system and are very similar to the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, I don't recommend you starting off with anything other than the traditional original deck. This deck has become really the heart and soul of tarot now. And so even when decks differ or stray away from the Rider-Waite-Smith system, they're still using the Rider-Waite-Smith system as a backdrop. You know, it's like, what's that saying? The exception proves the rule. So the fact that these other decks that have different systems are exceptions only reinforces how important the Rider-Waite-Smith system is to tarot deck creation and tarot deck structure. So if you want to have a really deep and thorough knowledge of the tarot, which you should want if you plan on reading for others, then starting with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is going to give you a full and thorough understanding of traditional tarot meanings and traditional tarot imagery. As you learn how to understand the imagery and the information provided in the cards in the traditional deck, you will also learn a lot about historical spirituality and about religious and spiritual symbolism, which is really important in the occult world and in magic. Whether we're talking about sigils, or we're talking about spells, or we're talking about sympathetic magic using images to represent magical targets, symbols, sacred sigils, hidden information, esoteric and occult information are all embedded in like every drop of ink in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And so just by studying and learning that deck, you learn a lot about spirituality in general. And in the converse, you need to learn those things about spirituality and about what those symbols mean in order to fully understand the deck. Learning from the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is also really helpful in terms of resources for you to learn. Typically, every tarot deck comes with a little guidebook that's created by the artists and the creators of the deck to help you to understand what they feel are the meanings behind the images and the cards and what that card could mean in somebody's life. So if you pull a card from a deck that's not a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and the description in the guidebook isn't enough for you to fully understand why that card has come up for you or how it applies to your question, then you're kind of SOL, because your only resource for what this card could mean is that guidebook. You have to rely heavily then on your intuition to try to glean, how this card applies to your given situation. And there's nothing wrong with that. Applying your intuition is an important part of what you do when you're reading, regardless of the type of deck that you are using. But if you're just getting started on your tarot journey, you are probably, not necessarily, but probably also just getting started on your spiritual journey. And listening to your intuition, having a really good relationship with your intuition to understand when you're receiving messages from spirit and not from somewhere else, takes some time and can be difficult for the new reader. So using the Rider-Waite-Smith deck allows you to have access to a world of resources. If the little book that comes with the deck is not enough to help you to understand why you pulled this card or what it means for you, hop on the internet, Go to the tarot section of any bookstore, whatever you want to use for your resources. And so you are bound to find somebody who has talked about the card in a way that speaks to you and that helps you understand why you pulled that card. Now, on the other hand, if you decided that reading tarot is a personal journey, at least at the moment, this is not about learning about all there is to know about tarot and becoming an expert in the tarot field. You just want to incorporate tarot into your own spiritual practices. You have a little bit more leeway when it comes to choosing your first deck. But I still recommend that you start off with a Rider-Waite-Smith based deck, okay? So I don't think it's super critical that you start off with the traditional imagery, the way I think it is if you're trying to read tarot for others or as a profession. I think it's fine to go ahead and get, the Barbie deck or the animal deck or the tiger deck or, whatever speaks to you. But I would say, I think it's really important that you pick a deck that still follows the Rider-Waite-Smith system of 78 cards, 22 major, 56 minor, 4 suits, etc., etc. Even if the imagery is totally different and you want to pick a deck that just speaks to you based on the images, and you are okay with the fact that the only information about what those images means is going to come from the guidebook that comes with the deck. If you're okay with all of that, then go ahead and do that and get a deck that just speaks to your heart based on the images. But if you get a deck that is a Rider-Waite-Smith system deck, that at least is like a backup for you if you feel stuck. Tip number 3 is to not worry about tarot myths. And I'm going to make a video about some commonly passed around myths that I'm going to dispel from my perspective and in my opinion. But there are quite a number of myths out there, like you can't buy your own first deck, or you must keep your cards covered in a certain type of cloth, or you can't let people touch your deck. You hear all of these different types of myths. And I'm maybe not being fair by referring to all of them as myths, because for some people in some traditions and in some communities, those myths might be absolute truths. It might be super, super important that you cover your deck in a certain way, or get your deck from a certain source according to your magical lineage, tradition, community, what have you. So if that's the case, then ignore me and of course listen to whatever your tradition says if you want to. But generally speaking, if there isn't some specific reason why adhering to that myth or that rule about what to do with your cards is important to you, then you shouldn't follow them. Your journey and your relationship with your cards is really all about you. And so if you hear something about where to get your cards, how to treat your cards, how often to cleanse it, yada, yada, throw all of that out the window and develop your own relationship with your cards and determine for yourself what makes sense for you. My 4th tip is to cleanse your deck. And you guys have probably already heard me say this about other things. It is very, very important that any item you bring into your spiritual practice is energetically cleansed before use. Whether we're talking about candles, tools for your altar, statues and representations, crystals, it really doesn't matter. Anything that you are getting from the outside world and bringing into your spiritual practice should be cleansed of any unwanted, lingering, and potentially negative energies that could be left on it from use from the last person or its last experience. So when you receive your deck, it's important that you cleanse it. How you cleanse it is entirely up to you. I did make a video on how I cleanse my items, and that video is based on, generally speaking, how Wiccans would go about energetically or spiritually cleansing an item. So if you're interested in how you could approach cleansing your tarot deck, I welcome you to check out that video. And my 5th tip is to commit to a regular relationship with your cards. Whether you plan to read for others or you are reading for yourself, purchasing your cards and then just sticking them on a bookshelf or tucking them away somewhere and only pulling them out every once in a while, or on Halloween or something like that, is not going to be of service to you or to the cards, really. Energy exists and grows where you put your attention, where you feed that energy bubble, essentially. And so by interacting with your cards on a regular basis, you continue to feed the energy bubble that makes those cards really unique to you and a really useful tool for you to establish that communication with your spirit guides and with the spirit realm. As you develop your relationship with your card, you will get to a point where what they are trying to tell you comes through really crystal clear. But the only way to do that is to cultivate a relationship with them. And you do that through regular interactions with them, and this can take whatever form works for you. Some people like to do the card a day method. I think this is a really great, straightforward and kind of easy way to get to know your cards. I think that's a great method. My only recommendation, if you take the card a day method, is to do it at night rather than in the morning. And the reason for that is if you pull the card in the morning, I find that it influences how you see the day, and you run the risk of kind of creating what the card presented to you, as opposed to letting the day happen and then pulling a card and being like, oh wow, yes, this came up for me today. This is exactly what my day was about. It's a little less, it prevents like impressionableness, I guess. But yeah, I recommend doing it at night. When you get to the end of the day, just take a moment before you go to bed, shuffle your cards, pull a card to represent what the day was for you, and then journal about the card. Why you think you pulled it, does it make sense, does it make no sense at all, etc. If pulling a card a day right now is too much of a commitment for you or doesn't work for what you want to use, tarot in your life for, then you can do it less frequently. I just really recommend that whatever you choose, you do it regularly and you really try to stick to it. I am a fan of the new book Intuitive Tarot by Brigitte Esselman from Biddy Tarot. Whether you get this particular book or something similar to it, because there are similar products out there that are like tarot planners, this is a really good one and it's really cute, and it's illustrated by a friend of mine, Ellie Mae Mooring, so I'm a little bit biased, but any type of a tarot planner that prompts you with different activities or things to write about every day based on a new card are really helpful. This book is useful because it doesn't teach you anything about the individual cards. What a tarot planner does instead is it gives you different activities and things to do every day to help you to build that relationship and build your knowledge. So witches, I really hope that you found that video helpful. If you did, or if you just liked it, please give me a thumbs up. If you have any comments or questions, just leave them for me down below. And of course, subscribe. Click on the bell button so you're notified every time a new video comes out. You can follow me on Instagram at BronxWitch, and I will see you in the next video. Blessed be.